My name is Emily Carter, and I was 38 years old when I stood outside Courtroom 4B with a brown envelope tucked beneath my arm and a judge's ruling echoing in my ears. The courtroom doors had barely opened when my ex-husband's younger brother slapped him on the back and laughed loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. "I told you," he said, "the truth always wins." Their mother wiped tears from her eyes, not because she was emotional but because she was celebrating. I knew she couldn't fool the court forever. My ex-husband, Daniel, adjusted his expensive navy blue suit and looked straight at me. "You should have accepted the settlement months ago," he said quietly. "Instead, you embarrassed yourself." I looked at him for 3 long seconds. Not because I had nothing to say. Because I knew something he didn't. The judge had ruled against me. The courtroom believed I had never contributed to our family's financial success. The official record now painted me as a woman who had lived comfortably on her husband's income, while offering nothing except excuses. Every member of Daniel's family smiled, as though justice had finally arrived. I turned toward the exit without answering anyone. The heavy courthouse door was only a few steps away when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. "Emily." I stopped. My attorney, Michael Hayes, nearly dropped his briefcase trying to catch up. His tie had come loose. His forehead was covered in sweat. He leaned close enough that no one else could hear him. "Wait," I frowned. "We haven't shown the judge the last document yet." For the first time that entire afternoon. I smiled. "But this story does not start here." Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. The story actually began more than 20 years earlier, in a small 2-bedroom house in Dayton, Ohio, where my parents taught me something that shaped every major decision I would ever make. My father repaired industrial machines for a manufacturing company. He worked exactly 47.5 hours every week, rarely took vacations, and wrote every household expense in a blue notebook he kept beside the refrigerator. My mother worked as a public library assistant. She earned much less than my father, but she managed every dollar with incredible discipline. On the first day of every month, she divided cash into labeled envelopes. Groceries, utilities, mortgage, emergency savings, education. There was never much money left. Yet somehow, every Christmas morning felt abundant. My parents never measured contribution by income. They measured it by responsibility. One earned more. The other organized everything. Both considered themselves equal. I didn't fully understand that lesson until much later. As a child, I loved solving problems. At age 9, I organized my classmates into study groups before math exams. At 12, I started helping our school's office organize attendance records, because the secretary joked that I was better than the filing cabinet. By 16, I had earned the highest GPA in my grade. When graduation arrived, I ranked 3rd out of 412 students. I received 2 academic scholarships. One covered tuition. The other paid for textbooks. I graduated from college with a degree in accounting after completing 148 credit hours and finishing an internship where I spent almost 8 months auditing small businesses. Numbers fascinated me. Not because they were perfect. Because they never cared about popularity. Numbers remembered everything. People didn't. When I was 24, I joined a regional logistics company as a junior financial analyst. That's where I met Daniel. He wasn't in finance. He worked in sales. Confident, funny, charming without trying too hard. Everyone liked him. He remembered birthdays. He brought coffee for coworkers. He spoke to executives with the same ease he used with receptionists. He had that rare ability to make every conversation feel personal. When he asked me to dinner, I almost declined. Work mattered more than dating. But he insisted only once. Respectfully. "No pressure," he smiled. "If you say no, I'll still steal your calculator every Monday." I laughed. It became our first date. For the first 3 years together, Daniel truly was a good partner. People often expect stories like mine to begin with obvious warning signs. There weren't many. At least not obvious ones. His family welcomed me warmly. His mother, Linda, was 54 then. She believed successful families needed clear roles. Her philosophy sounded reasonable whenever she explained it. Someone has to lead. She admired confidence. She admired visible success. Salespeople impressed her. Entrepreneurs impressed her. People who quietly managed systems behind the scenes didn't. Accounting wasn't glamorous enough. To Linda, financial records simply existed. She never wondered who created them. His father, George, had retired from construction. He rarely argued. He avoided conflict almost professionally. If Linda believed something, George usually nodded. Not because he always agreed. Because peace felt easier. Daniel's younger sister, Rachel, constantly compared achievements. Whose house was larger? Whose vacation cost more? Whose husband earned the highest salary? Competition energized her. Recognition mattered. Her husband, Kyle, measured people almost entirely through income. What do they make? Was often his first question after meeting someone new. None of them were monsters. They simply valued visible accomplishments more than invisible ones. That difference became important after Daniel decided to leave his stable job. He came home one evening carrying 3 folders. I have an idea. I listened. He wanted to start a commercial supply company specializing in warehouse equipment. Shelving. Packaging systems. Industrial safety products. The business required approximately $82,000 in startup capital. We only had $64,300 saved. Daniel looked nervous. I know it's risky. It is. I also know I can't do it alone. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I spent 2 weeks analyzing the industry. Market demand. Supplier relationships. Operating costs. Projected cash flow. Competitors within a 200-mile radius. I built spreadsheets containing more than 21 separate financial scenarios. Best case. Average case. Worst case. Daniel watched me every evening. You really enjoy this. I enjoy making expensive mistakes on paper instead of in real life. Eventually, I closed my laptop. It could work. His smile filled the room. But only if we stayed disciplined. He promised we would. During the first year of the business, Daniel handled customers. I handled everything else after finishing my own full-time job. Payroll, invoices, taxes, inventory forecasting, vendor contracts, insurance renewals, payroll tax filings, bank reconciliations, cash flow projections, quarterly reports, loan documentation. For nearly 4 years, I slept an average of 5 hours and 20 minutes each night, according to the fitness watch Daniel had given me on our anniversary. Our dining table disappeared beneath invoices. Weekends disappeared into spreadsheets. Vacations disappeared completely. Customers praised Daniel. Suppliers praised Daniel. Employees thanked Daniel. That made sense. He was the face everyone saw. I preferred remaining behind the scenes. Recognition never interested me. Stability did. By the end of our 3rd year, annual revenue reached $2.8 million. Daniel celebrated with the sales team. I celebrated by reconciling the year's final accounts before midnight. It sounds strange now, but I genuinely felt proud. Every accurate report meant another month of security. Every balanced statement meant another employee received a paycheck on time. One evening during a family barbecue, Linda raised her glass. I'm proud of my son. Everyone applauded. He built this business from nothing. Daniel smiled. I smiled too. Then George casually asked me, "So, are you still working at that office?" "Yes. And helping Daniel whenever you can." Whenever you can. I remember those 3 words more clearly than the weather that day. No one corrected him. Not even Daniel. I had worked almost every night for 3 years. Yet my contributions sounded like an occasional favor. I almost spoke. Instead, I remembered something from childhood. When I was 11, my class built a model bridge for a science competition. I designed the structure. Another student presented it. When we won first prize, teachers congratulated him because he held the project during the presentation. I cried on the bus ride home. My father listened quietly. Then he asked me one question. "Emily, if the bridge had collapsed, who would the teachers have blamed?" "The designer." Exactly. Real responsibility doesn't disappear simply because applause goes somewhere else. At 11, I thought he was trying to make me feel better. At 31, standing beside Daniel's family with paper plates in our hands, I finally understood what he meant. Recognition and responsibility were rarely distributed equally. Still, I believed marriages weren't competitions. Keeping score seemed unhealthy. So I stayed silent. Looking back now, silence was the most expensive habit I ever developed. Silence became routine so gradually that I never noticed when it stopped being patience and started becoming evidence against me. The business entered its 5th year stronger than any of us had imagined. Annual revenue crossed $4.1 million. We had 23 full-time employees, leased a 14,000 square foot warehouse, and had opened accounts with more than 180 recurring commercial clients. People congratulated Daniel everywhere we went. At industry conferences, customers recognized him before they reached the registration desk. "You're the guy who built Carter Industrial Supply." Daniel always smiled politely. "Thank you, we've worked hard." That word "we" made me feel included. But whenever someone asked what I did, the conversation changed. "Oh, Emily helps with the books." "Helps." The same word again. As though balancing millions of dollars in transactions, preparing payroll every other Friday, negotiating payment terms with suppliers, and preventing cash flow crises before anyone noticed them was the equivalent of bringing coffee into a meeting. I didn't correct anyone. Not because I lacked confidence. Because I thought protecting Daniel's public image protected our marriage too. It was a trade I kept making without realizing the cost. One evening I stayed in the office until 11:47 p.m. A supplier in Illinois had mistakenly billed us twice for a shipment worth $46,280. If we paid both invoices, payroll would be delayed by almost a week. Daniel had already gone home after meeting potential clients. I spent nearly 4 hours comparing purchase orders, delivery confirmations, freight records, and bank transfers. By midnight, I found the error. The supplier admitted the mistake the following morning. No one inside the company even knew a problem had existed. At breakfast, Daniel kissed my forehead. "You're amazing." I smiled. That was enough. Or at least I believed it was. Months later, one of our warehouse managers resigned unexpectedly. Employees panicked. Orders piled up. Customers called every hour asking about delayed shipments. Daniel looked exhausted. "I don't know how we're going to survive this month." I opened my notebook. "We don't need another manager immediately." He frowned. "What?" "We divide the responsibilities temporarily." I listed every task. Scheduling. Inventory verification. Carrier coordination. Returns. Safety inspections. Receiving. Dispatch. Then I reassigned each responsibility among existing supervisors. No one worked more than 6 additional hours each week. Productivity dropped only 3% instead of the projected 22%. Daniel looked at me like I'd performed magic. You figured that out in one night. It wasn't magic. It was information. Again, there were no speeches. No applause. No celebration. Just another invisible problem quietly disappearing. That became my specialty. Making disasters invisible. Ironically, invisible work is the easiest kind for other people to forget. Around that time, Daniel's personality began changing. Not dramatically. Gradually. Success attracts attention. Attention changes people in ways they often don't recognize. Customers invited him to exclusive golf clubs. Local business magazines interviewed him. He joined networking organizations where everyone introduced themselves with titles instead of names. Founder, President, CEO, Owner. I noticed something during those events. Whenever journalists asked about the company's history, Daniel started simplifying the story. I built the business from scratch. Technically, he wasn't lying. But he wasn't telling the whole truth either. The first few times, I assumed he was speaking casually. Then I noticed the pattern. The story became shorter every year. The details disappeared. Eventually, my role disappeared too. Not maliciously. Conveniently. One Saturday evening, we attended Rachel's birthday dinner. Halfway through dessert, Kyle raised his glass. A toast. Everyone looked toward him. To Daniel, the self-made businessman. Glasses clinked around the table. Linda smiled proudly. I always knew my son would become successful. Rachel laughed. And Emily found herself the right husband. Everyone chuckled. Everyone except me. It wasn't meant to insult me. That was the strange part. It was simply how they genuinely saw our lives. Daniel glanced toward me. For one brief second. I thought he might correct them. Instead, he lifted his own glass. Thank you. That single moment stayed with me longer than the entire dinner. Not because of what anyone else believed. Because the one person who knew the truth chose comfort over accuracy. When we drove home, the silence felt heavier than usual. Finally, I asked quietly, "Do you think they're right?" He kept his eyes on the road. About what? That I just happened to marry the right person. He sighed. Emily, I'm asking seriously. You know what you contributed. I do. So why does it matter what everyone else thinks? Because someday, I almost said, someday memories become stories. Stories become facts. Facts become records. But I stayed quiet. Again. About 6 months later, Daniel suggested hiring a full-time finance director. It'll reduce your workload. I agreed immediately. Not because I wanted less responsibility. Because I wanted our marriage back. We hired Karen Mitchell, a CPA with 16 years of experience. For 3 months I trained her personally. Every vendor. Every process. Every reporting schedule. Every banking relationship. She kept stopping to ask the same question. You built all this. It's just systems. No, she shook her head. It's architecture. I laughed. They're spreadsheets. She smiled. No, Emily. Spreadsheets don't run companies. People who understand them do. It was one of the few times anyone outside, my parents, had recognized the difference. After Karen took over daily accounting, I finally had evenings free. I thought Daniel and I would reconnect. Instead, we discovered we had spent so many years building the business that we no longer knew how to build each other. Conversations became shorter. Business dinners became more frequent. Phone calls during weekends became normal. Daniel traveled constantly. Chicago, Dallas, Atlanta, Seattle, sometimes 3 cities in 1 week. At first, I admired his dedication. Then I noticed he talked about work even when he wasn't working. Success had become more than his career. It had become his identity. One rainy Tuesday, I found him sitting alone in our kitchen after midnight. The lights were off. Only the refrigerator illuminated the room. "You okay?" He didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, "Do you ever feel like people only value what you achieve?" I pulled out the chair opposite him. "I think everyone feels that sometimes." He nodded. "If I lost everything, would anyone still respect me?" It was an honest question. Not defensive. Not arrogant. Just afraid. I reached across the table and held his hand. "I would." He smiled sadly. "I know. Looking back, I think that conversation explained more than I realized." Daniel had started believing his value depended entirely on being successful. People who believe that often become terrified of sharing credit. Because sharing credit feels like sharing identity. Unfortunately, fear has a way of rewriting history. And history, once rewritten enough times, begins sounding true even to the person rewriting it. I didn't understand that then. I would understand it years later. Inside a courtroom. The first crack in our marriage did not arrive with shouting. It arrived with paperwork. Karen walked into my office one Thursday morning, carrying a stack of vendor contracts. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She closed the door before sitting down. "I've been reviewing the ownership records." I looked up. "What about them?" "There have been several amendments over the years." "That's normal." She hesitated. "No, I mean the percentages." For a moment, I didn't understand what she meant. Then she slid a copy of one document across the desk. The company had originally been registered, with both of our names attached to the organizational paperwork, because we had signed every loan guarantee together. Later, after refinancing and restructuring, Daniel had become the sole listed owner. My signature appeared on every required consent form. Legally, everything had been done correctly. I simply hadn't questioned it. Not because I was careless. Because I trusted my husband. Karen spoke carefully. "I'm not saying anything improper happened. I'm only asking, did you intend for everything to be transferred this way?" I stared at the document for nearly a minute. "I remember signing. But I don't remember discussing the long-term consequences." Karen nodded slowly. "Sometimes people sign whatever is placed in front of them because they're focused on running the business." Her words stayed with me all afternoon. That evening I asked Daniel about it. He didn't become angry. He seemed almost confused. "Emily, the bank suggested simplifying the ownership structure." "I know. So what's the problem?" "I just don't remember us talking about what it meant." He shrugged. "We're married. It's all ours anyway." At the time, that answer sounded reasonable. I let it go. Again, over the next 2 years, the company continued growing. Revenue passed $6.3 million. We purchased our warehouse instead of leasing it. Daniel appeared on the cover of a regional business magazine. The headline read, "The Self-Made Entrepreneur CHANGING Midwest Logistics." I read the entire interview. Not once was my name mentioned. I wasn't angry. I was surprised. The reporter hadn't ignored me. They simply wrote the story they had been told. That evening, the framed magazine cover arrived at our house. Linda came over carrying flowers. I bought 3 extra copies. She smiled proudly at Daniel. "This is history." She turned toward me. "You should hang one in your office." "I will." Then she laughed. "You'll be able to tell everyone you watched greatness happen." Watched. Another word. Small. Almost harmless. Yet somehow each one quietly erased another piece of reality. I looked at Daniel. He smiled politely. He said nothing. A few weeks later my father visited. He stood in Daniel's office, studying the framed magazine cover. Then he asked one simple question. Did the reporter interview Emily? Daniel looked uncomfortable. Not really. Dad nodded once. Nothing else. When we walked outside together later that afternoon, he placed a hand on my shoulder. Do you remember your science bridge? I laughed softly. I do. Then remember something else. Blueprints are usually stored in drawers. Buildings get photographed. The photograph doesn't prove who designed it. I smiled. You always speak in riddles. No. He looked at me kindly. I speak in patience. I wish I had listened more carefully. Because patience and silence are not the same thing. About a year later, my mother passed away after a brief illness. Everything slowed. For months, I stopped caring about business reports. Profit margins. Expansion plans. None of it mattered. Daniel tried to be supportive. He attended the funeral. He handled visitors. He made coffee for relatives. For that, I will always give him credit. People are rarely only one thing. He loved me in many genuine ways. But grief changes relationships. I needed someone to sit quietly with me. Daniel coped by working longer hours. Neither approach was wrong. They were simply different. The distance between us widened. By our 15th wedding anniversary, we celebrated with dinner that lasted less than an hour because Daniel had an early morning flight. He apologized. I'll make it up to you. I believed him. He believed himself too. Sometimes broken promises are sincere. Life just keeps interrupting them. Then came the conversation that changed everything. It was a Sunday evening. The house was unusually quiet. Daniel stood by the kitchen window for almost 5 minutes before speaking. I think... He stopped. I think we've become different people. I already knew where the conversation was heading. Still, hearing it felt like stepping onto ice you know will break. Are you saying... Yes. He closed his eyes briefly. I think we should separate. There was no screaming. No accusations. No dramatic exit. Just two exhausted people admitting that the marriage they had built no longer existed. The divorce process began 2 months later. At first, I assumed we would resolve everything privately. We both had lawyers. We both had financial records. I believed facts would keep emotions under control. I was wrong. Very wrong. The first sign came during mediation. Daniel's attorney outlined the company's history. I listened quietly. Then I heard a sentence that made my stomach tighten. My client independently created and developed the business through his entrepreneurial efforts. Independently. I looked toward Daniel. Surely he would interrupt. He didn't. After the meeting ended, I caught him in the hallway. Why didn't you correct that? He sighed. It was just legal wording. It wasn't true. It doesn't change anything. It changes everything. He rubbed his forehead. Emily, the lawyers are simplifying things. No, I answered quietly. They're rewriting them. For the first time since we had met 20 years earlier. Daniel looked away before I did. The months that followed became increasingly painful. Not because of the legal process itself. Because every filing seemed to erase another chapter of our shared life. Documents referred to me as a supportive spouse, as homemaker, an occasional administrative assistant. Occasional. I almost laughed when I read it. There were years when I had processed more financial transactions than anyone else in the company. Years when I had slept 5 hours a night keeping payroll alive. Years when I had quietly solved crises no customer ever knew existed. Occasional words matter, especially inside court records. Michael, my attorney, noticed my expression. Don't focus on the language. I have to. Why? Because someone reading this 20 years from now will think it's true. He nodded thoughtfully. Then he asked me something unexpected. Emily, do you still have everything? What do you mean? Everything. The emails, the drafts, the original spreadsheets, the planning notes, the loan calculations, the vendor negotiations, the payroll archives. I stared at him. I've never deleted anything. A slow smile spread across his face. Good. Very good. That afternoon, we rented a secure storage unit for boxes of old files. Then we backed up every hard drive I had ever used. Laptop from 2008. External drives. Archived email accounts. Cloud backups. Old USB sticks labeled with fading marker. For nearly 3 weeks we organized documents. Not because we planned to overwhelm the court. Because we wanted one thing. Accuracy. One evening Michael held up an old spiral notebook. What's this? I smiled immediately. My budgeting notebook. When's it from? The first year of the business. Inside were handwritten calculations. Supplier projections. Cash flow estimates. Inventory forecasts. Every page dated. Every correction initialed. Michael looked impressed. You kept all this? My father taught me. If something matters, write it down. He carefully placed the notebook into a labeled evidence box. Then he looked directly at me. I don't know how this case ends. But I can promise you one thing. The truth usually leaves a paper trail. At that moment, neither of us realized just how important one forgotten document would become. Discovery lasted almost 7 months. If you've never been through a complicated civil case, it is difficult to explain how exhausting the process becomes. People imagine dramatic courtroom arguments. In reality, most of it happens inside conference rooms filled with bankers' boxes, laptops, highlighted contracts and calendars. Every statement has to be supported. Every date has to match another date. Every signature has to be authenticated. The truth isn't only about what happened. It's about what can be proven. Michael warned me from the beginning. Emily, don't exaggerate. I won't. Don't guess. I won't. If you don't remember something, say you don't remember. I understand. He smiled. Good. Judges trust people who admit the limits of their memory. Across the table, Daniel's legal team worked just as hard. I respected that. They weren't villains. They were doing the job they had been hired to do. What hurt wasn't their strategy. It was that Daniel kept approving it. One afternoon, we received his official affidavit. I read every page slowly. The first several paragraphs described how he had started the business. Most of it was accurate. Then I reached one sentence. My former wife never played a meaningful role in the financial development or operational management of the company. I stopped reading. Not because I was angry. Because I genuinely wondered how someone who had lived the same years as I had could remember them so differently. Michael looked at me. You okay? I handed him the affidavit. He read the sentence. Then he quietly closed the folder. We'll answer it. No. I shook my head. We'll document it. That distinction mattered. Arguments create noise. Documentation creates history. Over the following weeks, we assembled timelines. One email from 2009. Another from 2011. Payroll approvals. Vendor negotiations. Tax filings. Loan correspondence. Insurance renewals. Nothing dramatic. Just thousands of ordinary decisions that together showed who had actually been doing the work. One evening, Michael spread several documents across the conference table. "Do you notice something?" I studied them. Every one contained my initials. Every revision. Every approval. Every financial projection. Every budget adjustment. He nodded. Patterns convince judges. Not isolated moments. That sentence stayed with me. Patterns. My father had once told me that life wasn't changed by a single decision. It was shaped by repeated habits. The legal system, I realized, wasn't very different. Then came depositions. I had never given sworn testimony before. The court reporter sat quietly typing every word. Daniel's attorney was polite. Professional. Methodical. "Mrs. Carter, did you personally negotiate sales contracts?" "No." "Did you travel to acquire customers?" "No." "Did you supervise warehouse employees?" "Not directly." He nodded as if confirming something important. Then he asked, "So your husband operated the business?" I answered carefully. My husband operated the customer-facing side. I operated the financial infrastructure. He looked up. "What do you mean by infrastructure?" I spent almost 15 minutes explaining. Cash management, payroll, tax compliance, forecasting, debt servicing, insurance, bank reporting, vendor relationships, internal controls, budget planning. He wrote notes. No expression. No reaction. When the deposition ended, Michael whispered, "You did well." "I don't know." "You answered exactly what was asked. And you didn't volunteer anything. That's harder than people think." A week later, Daniel gave his deposition. I wasn't allowed to interrupt. I simply listened. He described himself as the founder. Fair enough. He described himself as the decision-maker. Mostly fair. Then came another sentence. Emily occasionally reviewed financial paperwork. Occasionally. There it was again. The word had become almost symbolic. It followed me through every stage of the divorce. Occasionally. Helping. Supportive. Administrative. Every description sounded small enough to be believable. That's what made it dangerous. Large lies are easy to expose. Small reductions are much harder. Because each one contains a fragment of truth. After Daniel's deposition, Michael looked unusually thoughtful. "What? I think I know what they're doing." "What?" "They aren't trying to prove you did nothing. They're trying to make the judge believe what you did wasn't important." I leaned back. He was right. That was exactly the strategy. Not denial. Minimization. It was clever. And unfortunately, very persuasive. The trial finally began almost 18 months after our separation. Walking into that courtroom felt strangely familiar. Not because I had been there before. Because it reminded me of auditing. Everything depended on evidence. Opinions mattered less than records. Still, courtrooms are emotional places. Families fill the benches. Friends whisper. People choose sides long before the judge enters. Daniel's entire family attended every hearing. Linda, George, Rachel, Kyle, even cousins I had met only once or twice over 15 years. When I walked past them that first morning, nobody spoke. Nobody had to. Silence can communicate just as clearly as words. During opening statements, Daniel's attorney spoke confidently. My client built a successful business through years of determination. He described long hours, financial risks, personal sacrifice. Everything he said was true. What he didn't say was also true. Michael stood when it was our turn. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "This case is not about denying Mr. Carter's accomplishments. It is about whether history should be edited after success arrives." I glanced toward the judge. For the first time, he looked genuinely interested. Over several days, witnesses testified. Former employees, bank representatives, business associates. Most remembered Daniel. Few remembered me. That wasn't surprising. I had designed systems, not relationships. One warehouse supervisor said, "I mostly saw Mrs. Carter in the office." Another added, "She was always working on the computers." None of them understood exactly what I was doing. Why would they? When systems work properly, they're almost invisible. Courtroom testified near the end of the week. Daniel's attorney asked, "When you joined the company, who trained you?" "Emily Carter." "How long?" "About 3 months. "And what exactly did she teach you?" Courtroom smiled politely. "Everything." The courtroom became very quiet. She continued, "I had managed finance departments before, but this company's financial systems were unusually detailed. I asked who designed them. Mrs. Carter told me she had." Daniel's attorney stood. "Isn't it possible she was simply maintaining existing procedures?" Courtroom answered without hesitation. "No, you don't maintain something that didn't exist before you built it." I looked down at the table. Not because I was emotional. Because after years of being described as someone who merely helped, hearing a professional describe my work accurately felt almost unfamiliar. Still, the strongest evidence had not yet appeared. And neither side knew it. When it was my turn to testify, the courtroom felt much smaller than it had all week. The judge adjusted his glasses. The court reporter placed fresh paper into her machine. Michael walked toward the witness stand. He didn't begin with the business. He began with my life. "Mrs. Carter, what was your profession before the company existed?" "I was a financial analyst." "How long?" "Almost 6 years." "What were your responsibilities?" I explained. Budget forecasting, risk analysis, cash flow modeling, internal financial controls. He handed me an old resume. "Is this yours?" "Yes." "What year?" 2004. The judge examined it for several seconds before handing it back. Michael smiled slightly. "So you already possessed these skills before the business was formed?" "Yes." Then we moved through the years carefully. One calendar, one email, one spreadsheet, one bank record at a time. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just quiet facts. Michael displayed a payroll authorization from the company's 2nd year. "Whose approval appears here?" "Mine." Another document. "Vendor negotiations. Insurance renewals. Quarterly tax filings. Loan projections. Emergency cash flow forecasts prepared during the recession." Again and again. My handwriting. My initials. My calculations. Daniel's attorney objected several times. The judge overruled most of them. By the afternoon, I noticed something changing. Not the judge's expression. The courtroom's attention. People who had assumed accounting meant entering numbers into software slowly realized they were looking at the operating system behind an entire company. During cross-examination, Daniel's attorney remained calm. He walked toward me carrying only a yellow legal pad. Mrs. Carter, you've described many financial responsibilities. Correct. Would the business have existed without customers? No. Would customers have existed without Mr. Carter? He brought many of them. So he was essential. Yes. He nodded confidently. And you were not. Michael immediately objected. Sustained, the judge replied before I could answer. The attorney changed direction. You've never claimed to be the public face of the business. No. You've never claimed to negotiate major sales. No. You've never claimed to supervise warehouse operations. No. He smiled. So your contribution was limited. I looked directly at him. My contribution was specialized. The courtroom fell silent. He paused, then asked one final question. If you were so important, why is Mr. Carter listed as the owner? I answered honestly. Because I trusted my husband. No one spoke. Even Daniel looked down. When I stepped away from the witness stand, I didn't know whether I had helped my case. I only knew I had told the truth. The following morning, Daniel testified. He spoke confidently. Comfortably. Years of sales experience had taught him how to present a convincing narrative. He described sleeping in his truck while building the business. True. He described missing birthdays because he was visiting clients. Also true. He described risking everything. Again. True. Then came the sentence I will never forget. My former wife was supportive. But she never materially contributed to creating the company. Materially. One word. One carefully chosen legal word. It echoed through the courtroom. I didn't react. Michael didn't react. He simply wrote something on a yellow sticky note. Then he folded it in half. Hours later, during cross-examination, Michael approached slowly. Mr. Carter, you've testified that Mrs. Carter never materially contributed. Correct. You stand by that? I do. Michael nodded. He picked up a binder. Who prepared your payroll tax reports during the first 4 years? I don't remember. Who prepared your annual cash flow projections? I assume our accountant. Michael flipped another page. There was no accountant. Daniel hesitated. My wife handled paperwork. Occasionally. The word appeared again. Occasionally. Michael looked toward the judge. Then back at Daniel. Mr. Carter, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. If Mrs. Carter stopped working on the company's finances in year 2, and what was your backup plan? Daniel remained silent. Michael waited. There wasn't one. So if she had left, and could payroll still have been processed? I don't know. Could quarterly taxes have been filed? I suppose. By whom? Silence. Could the bank reporting requirements have been completed? Silence again. Finally Daniel answered quietly. I don't know. Michael thanked him. Then sat down. No dramatic confrontation. No raised voices. Just unanswered questions. Closing arguments arrived 3 days later. Daniel's attorney summarized the case clearly. The law recognizes ownership. My client owned the business. He accepted the risk. He deserves the reward. It was a strong argument. Michael stood last. He didn't challenge ownership. Instead, he said something that stayed with me forever. Your Honor, there is a difference between being visible and being valuable. History often remembers the person standing at the front of the photograph. But businesses, families, hospitals, schools, and governments also depend on people whose names never appear beneath headlines. This case asks a simple question. Should invisible work become legally invisible simply because it was performed quietly. Then he sat down. The judge thanked both attorneys. He announced that his written decision would be issued the following week. Those 7 days felt longer than the previous 18 months. I barely slept. Not because of money. Because I wanted the record to reflect reality. When the decision finally came, the courtroom filled quickly. Daniel's family occupied the first 2 rows. Linda looked confident. Rachel whispered something to Kyle and smiled. The judge read his findings carefully. He acknowledged my hard work. He praised my professionalism. Then, he ruled that the legal ownership documents carried greater weight than my indirect contributions. My requests were denied. For a moment, the room disappeared. Not because I was shocked. Because I realized that truth and proof are not always the same thing. The judge wasn't calling me dishonest. He simply believed the documents before him required a different legal outcome. Daniel's family erupted into quiet celebration. Linda hugged Rachel. Kyle shook Daniel's hand. Someone behind me whispered, "I knew she'd lose." I gathered my notebook, closed my briefcase, thanked Michael for his work, and walked toward the courtroom door without saying a single word. Behind me I heard laughter, then applause from someone quickly silenced by a court officer. I reached the large wooden doors, placed my hand on the handle, and that's when I heard hurried footsteps. Emily. It was Michael, breathing hard, holding a single cream-colored folder. He stopped beside me. His eyes were wide. "I found it." "What?" "The document." I frowned. "What document?" He carefully opened the folder. Inside was a certified copy of something neither of us had seen during the trial preparation. He looked at me and said quietly, "Wait, we haven't shown the judge the last document yet." I stared at the folder without taking it. For a second, I honestly thought Michael was joking. The hearing had ended. The judge had ruled. People were already gathering their coats. Court officers were directing everyone toward the exits. "What do you mean?" I asked. Michael carefully turned the first page toward me. It was attached to an archived loan renewal file. I didn't receive it until 23 minutes ago. I frowned. "But we've already closed the case." "Not yet." He pointed toward a handwritten notation, stamped by the county clerk nearly 16 years earlier. This document was never included in either party's production. I looked closer. Then my heartbeat changed. I recognized the paper immediately. Not because I remembered every word. Because I remembered the day it had been signed. It was the spring of our 2nd year in business. The bank had agreed to extend our operating line of credit from $250,000 to $600,000. Without that approval, we would have missed payroll within 3 months. The bank had required something unusual before approving the loan. Not additional collateral. Not another guarantor. They had required a written assessment explaining who actually designed and controlled the company's financial systems. I remembered writing drafts for almost a week. I also remembered the loan officer insisting that the statement be signed by Daniel. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. It was simply another requirement. Another piece of paperwork. Another ordinary Tuesday. Michael tapped the page. "Read the highlighted paragraph." I did. The words blurred for a moment before coming back into focus. The bank acknowledges that the company's internal financial controls, budgeting process, forecasting model, vendor payment structure, and cash management system were designed and implemented by Mrs. Emily Carter. Approval of this credit facility is based substantially upon her continued management of these systems. Below that paragraph, Daniel's signature, the senior loan officer's signature, the bank manager's signature, and the county's certification seal. I closed my eyes. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I suddenly remembered something else. The bank manager had looked at Daniel after the meeting and said, "Sales may bring in revenue, but systems determine whether businesses survive." At the time, we had both smiled. Neither of us imagined those words would matter 16 years later. Michael looked toward the courtroom. "We need to move. The judge hasn't left the bench. Court procedures are more structured than television makes them appear. You cannot simply run back into a courtroom waving papers." Michael approached the bailiff first. He spoke quietly. The bailiff frowned, then disappeared through a side door carrying the folder. Almost 4 minutes passed. No one spoke. Daniel's family continued celebrating in the hallway. They hadn't noticed us. Then the bailiff returned. "The judge will hear counsel in chambers. Not the full courtroom. Not another trial. Just a private legal conference." Daniel's attorney looked surprised when he was informed. So did Daniel. 20 minutes later, we entered the judge's chambers. The room felt completely different from the courtroom. No audience. No public benches. Just bookshelves, legal files, and a large wooden desk. The judge removed his glasses. "Mr. Hayes, you requested immediate review. Explain." Michael handed him the certified document. "Your Honor, this record was located in archived banking files after today's ruling. It was not previously produced. We believe it is directly relevant to one factual finding contained in the court's written decision." The judge read silently. For nearly 3 minutes. Nobody interrupted. Nobody shifted in their chair. Finally, he looked toward Daniel. "Mr. Carter, is this your signature?" Daniel leaned forward. His face lost color almost immediately. "Oh, yes." The judge looked at another page. And this statement accurately reflected the circumstances when it was signed. Daniel swallowed. "Yes." His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently. Daniel didn't answer. The judge continued reading. Then he asked a question that changed the entire atmosphere. "In your testimony, you stated under oath that Mrs. Carter never materially contributed to the company's financial development." He paused. "This document appears to state the opposite." Silence. Real silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence created when everyone in a room realizes that the facts have suddenly shifted. Daniel finally spoke. "Your Honor, that document was prepared years ago." "I understand." The judge nodded calmly. "But were the statements true when you signed them?" "Oh, yes." "Were they false during your testimony?" Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time since our divorce proceedings began. He didn't have a prepared answer. His attorney requested permission to speak. The judge allowed it. They spent almost 5 minutes whispering together. Finally, the attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client wishes to clarify portions of his earlier testimony." The judge folded his hands. "I imagine he does." No sarcasm. No anger. Just quiet disappointment. Daniel looked at me for the first time all afternoon. His expression wasn't defensive anymore. It was tired. Deeply tired. "I never meant to say she did nothing." He spoke so quietly that everyone leaned forward. I kept thinking about ownership. And somewhere along the way, I started describing ownership as if it meant contribution. He stopped, then added something I never expected to hear. "That wasn't accurate." The room remained silent. The judge made several notes. Then he addressed both attorneys. "I am not prepared to ignore sworn testimony that appears inconsistent with contemporaneous documentary evidence." He scheduled an additional evidentiary hearing. The original judgment would not become final until that hearing concluded. Outside the chambers, nobody celebrated. Nobody spoke loudly. Daniel's family stood in the hallway looking confused. Linda approached first. "What happened?" Daniel answered without looking at anyone. "We're not finished." Rachel frowned. "I thought you already won." "So did I." Those 4 words carried more weight than any argument we'd heard over the previous 18 months. As Michael and I walked toward the parking garage, neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. Finally I asked, "Does this guarantee anything?" He smiled gently. "No, it guarantees nothing. But it guarantees the court now has the complete record. For the first time since the divorce began. That was enough for me. Not victory. Completeness. Because facts don't always arrive when people expect them. Sometimes, the last document changes everything.